The first sound was hooves. Cecily Vane heard them before Sister Margaret did, before the old porter at his post beside the bell rope stirred from his half-sleep, before the candle she carried down the stone corridor had even steadied in her hand. 3 horses, she thought, or 4, moving fast along the lane that led from the Hartbourne Road to the convent of St. Bridget of Meath, not the careful pace of a physician's horse, not the deliberate single-mount trot of a messenger. These were horses pushed, and the men pushing them were in a hurry, and it was 11:30 on a November night, and she had spent 12 weeks learning to be afraid of sounds exactly like this one. She did not run. She had learned not to run. She turned back down the corridor instead, moving quickly, and pushed open the door to the small cell where Edmund slept in his borrowed cradle. He was 14 months old, and not given to sleeping long. But he was sleeping now, his round face pale in the darkness, his breath the slow, measured breath of complete safety. She stood over him for a moment. The hoofbeats had stopped. She heard voices at the outer gate, low and male and carrying an authority she recognized even at this distance, the kind of authority that expected to be let in. She picked Edmund up without waking him. That was something she had become skilled at in the 12 weeks since Lord Hartbourne died. She was skilled at a great many things she had never expected to need. She carried him to the back passage, to the room that connected the infirmary to the chapel, where Sister Agnes kept a second cradle for a parishioner's child she sometimes minded. She laid him there. She smoothed the wool blanket. She straightened. She went back down the corridor toward the gate, pulling her shawl around her shoulders, her face already arranged. If they had come this far, they had come for the boy, and they would not get him from her. Not tonight, and not by arriving uninvited in the dark. She should explain what had brought her here, what had brought Edmund here, what had brought a woman of 24 without title or independent income, or a single relation in England who could be trusted to a convent in the Wiltshire Hills with an infant earl and a wooden horse in her pocket. She had been Lord Hartbourne's ward since she was 11 years old. That was the honest beginning of the story. The place the world had decided to start it, though the world had its own preferred ending that she did not intend to provide. Her father had been the Earl's steward, and when he died of a fever in the wet summer of 1812, the Earl, Thomas Carey, the 5th Earl of Hartbourne, a quiet man with a habit of doing the right thing when no one was watching, had taken her into the household. Not as a servant. Not quite as a daughter. As a ward, which was a word that meant she was his responsibility and that she had no other claim on anyone. She had been educated alongside his daughter, before the daughter married and went to Yorkshire. She had managed the household accounts when the Countess grew ill. She had sat with the Countess during her final confinement, the one that produced Edmund and cost the Countess her life. And she had held the Countess's hand at the end and promised, without being asked, because no one had thought to ask her, no one had thought she was capable of anything so weighty, that she would not let the child come to harm. The Earl had lived another 4 months, long enough to see his son sit up, long enough to press a small wooden carving into Cecily's hand one morning, while the house was quiet, a horse no larger than her palm, carved from a piece of oak the Earl had shaped himself during the long, idle months of his illness. "He will want it when he is older," the Earl had said. "Keep it for him." He had looked at her with the direct, clear look of a man settling his affairs, and she had understood without the words that this was not merely about the toy. He died on a Tuesday in late August. By Thursday, Hector Vane had arrived. Hector was a cousin, Cecily's own distant cousin, as it happened, which was a coincidence the world found ironic in ways she did not. He was the Earl's nearest male relation now that the earldom's succession was in dispute, and he had ridden from his property in Hampshire with the speed of a man who had already written the letter he intended to hand the family's solicitor. He was pale and precise, and not entirely unpleasant in the way that certain men who have been carefully educated to want things they have not yet obtained are not entirely unpleasant. He called Cecily by her given name without asking her leave, and on the first evening he said to his mother, Lady Dorothea Vane, who had followed him by carriage, in a voice pitched to carry across the corridor where Cecily happened to be standing, "She's merely the ward, of course. We need not account to her." Lady Dorothea had a fan she carried even in private. She had snapped it shut. "No," she said. "We need not." Cecily had put Edmund in her arms and walked out of the house that night. She had walked 3 miles to the house of Mr. Forsyth, the family's solicitor, who was a cautious and decent man, who did not like the cousin, and who had said to her when she arrived at his door, Edmund heavy against her shoulder, her half-boots muddy to the ankle, "I cannot keep him here, yet I believe I know where you might be safe while I locate the document." The Earl, Miss Vane, was not unprepared. He named a co-guardian, and the instrument exists. I have seen it. I have simply not yet been able to put my hands on it. "What document?" she had said. "A co-guardianship instrument, executed in July. A duke. A man Lord Hartbourne trusted absolutely." She had not asked the name. She had taken Edmund to the convent because she had been educated here for 3 years as a girl, and because Sister Margaret, who was now the abbess, had held her hand at her father's funeral and had known her before she was anyone's ward, when she was simply a steward's daughter who read quickly and prayed without much conviction, and had no one at all. That had been 6 weeks ago. And now there were horses at the gate. The porter was already lifting the lantern when she came into the outer court. The voices at the gate had stopped. There was a silence she did not like. The kind of silence that meant someone on the other side had made a decision. "Miss Vane." The porter looked at her with the particular expression of old men who have seen enough of the world to understand that young women arriving at convents at night and refusing to say anything about it are generally in some kind of trouble. "There is a duke at the gate." She had not expected that particular word. "Open it," she said, "and then stand behind me." He was tall. That was the first fact, and in the light of the lantern it crowded out all the others for a moment. He wore a dark riding coat and no hat, and he had the look of a man who had been in the saddle since morning and had not thought about it. His hair was black with the cold damp of the night, and his face in the lantern light was the kind of face that told you nothing. A jaw set still, eyes the color of pewter, a mouth that might have been generous once, and was now simply level. 2 men waited behind him with the horses. He looked at Cecily across the gate's iron bars with a directness she found immediately, unreasonably, difficult. "Miss Vane," he said. Not a question. "Your Grace," she said, because if he was who the porter said he was, this was the correct form of address. "I am Wexford." His voice was low and even, and she could hear in it that he was not a man who found it useful to raise it. "I believe you have something that belongs to me." The cold settled into her chest. She had prepared for many versions of this moment. Hector with a warrant, a creditor with a claim, a magistrate with the official weight of the county behind him. And she had not prepared for this. A duke in the dark saying those particular words in that particular voice, looking at her as if she were a problem he intended to solve before midnight. "Edmund Carey," she said carefully, "belongs to no one." "He is my ward," the Duke said. "I was named his co-guardian in July. I have the instrument. Mr. Forsyth has been unable to locate that instrument. Mr. Forsyth did not have access to my copy." He reached inside his coat and withdrew an envelope. He held it through the bars. She did not take it. "Your Grace may return in the morning," she said, with Mr. Forsyth present. Something moved in his face. Not frustration, precisely, but a narrowing, a recalibration. He looked at her for a long moment in the lantern light. She did not know what he saw, but she held very still. Because she had learned that stillness was the only armor she had left, and she was not going to give it up for a duke she had never met, who arrived at 11 o'clock at night saying the heir was his. "You do not trust me," he said. "I do not know you," she said. He was quiet for a moment. The horses shifted behind him. The cold breathed off the stone walls of the convent. "Very well," he said. "I will wait." She had expected argument. She had expected rank deployed as leverage, the implicit threat that he could compel entry if he chose, the reminder of his title and her lack of one. Instead, he stepped back and spoke to one of his men, and the man led a horse toward the low wall at the edge of the court. And the Duke sat down on the convent stone step in his riding coat, with the envelope in his gloved hand. He waited. She did not sleep. She sat in the infirmary passage with Edmund on her lap, the wooden horse in her pocket pressing against her hip through the fabric of her gown, and she did not sleep because she had not slept properly in 6 weeks, and because there was a duke on the front step, and because Edmund had woken once, and she had sung him back under with the same 2 verses she always used, the ones her father had sung to her that she had never taught to anyone. She did not hear the door. She only knew, sometime before the night had decided to become morning, that she was no longer alone in the passage. She looked up, and there was a figure in the doorway. The Duke, his dark coat dusty at the shoulders from the step, his expression composed but altered in some way she could not immediately name. He was looking at her. Not at Edmund. At her. She met his eyes across the dim space, and she felt something move through her that she did not have a name for, an awareness that he had been there long enough to see her before she could arrange her face, and that whatever he had seen had made the careful blankness of his expression go very still in a different way than it had been still at the gate. He did not speak. He turned and went back down the passage without a word. She sat for a long time after that, the child warm and heavy in her lap, the wooden horse solid against her hip, something shifting in the darkness that she could not account for and was not entirely willing to examine. When the bells rang for lauds, she rose. He was in the parlor when Sister Margaret brought him in at first light. He had combed his hair and asked for water, she supposed, because the worst of the night's dust was gone from his coat. He stood when Cecily entered with Edmund against her shoulder, which surprised her, because men of his rank did not generally rise for women of hers. He held out the envelope again. This time, she took it. Mr. Forsyth's hand. She recognized it in the first 3 lines. She read the document to its end, Edmund beginning to fuss against her shoulder, and she kept her face still throughout, which cost her something, because what the document said was that the Earl had planned for this, had trusted this man, had given his son 2 guardians, and had not been unprepared, whatever the appearance of these weeks had suggested. "He did not tell me," she said, looking up. "He did not tell me that he had told you nothing," the Duke said. "I assumed you knew. I knew there was a document, not who." He was looking at Edmund with an expression she could not read. The child had stopped fussing and was staring at the Duke with the complete and curious attention of very young children confronting new faces. "How long has he been here?" the Duke said. 6 weeks. Vane has been to the estate twice. He has told the solicitor in Bath that the heir cannot be found. "He knows where I am," she said. "He does not yet have the legal position to compel anything. He is building his case. When he has it built to his satisfaction, he will come." The Duke's jaw was very still. "Then we have time to move first." Move first how? I will go to London, he said, and file the instrument. With the instrument filed, Vane has no case. Edmund's guardianship is established, yours and mine together. She was quiet for a moment. Edmund had grabbed a fistful of her hair and was conducting an investigation into whether it would detach. Why together? She said. It was not quite what she had meant to say. She had meant to ask something more precise, something about procedure, but the question that had come out was the honest one, and it was already in the air between them. He looked at her with the pewter eyes that gave nothing away. Because you are the one who got him here, he said. That was not nothing, Miss Vane. She did not thank him. She thought, standing in the convent parlor with the Earl's heir pulling her hair, and the Earl's co-guardian watching her with that careful assessment, that she did not entirely know what to do with a man who said that was not nothing, when every other voice in her life had spent 12 weeks explaining what she was. I'm going to sit down, she said, because Edmund was heavier than he looked, and the night had been long. He said, sit down. The words were level and immediate. Not quite a command, and not quite permission. A reaching out of some sort that he did not seem to know he was doing. He crossed to the chair near the window and moved it toward her without asking, and she sat in it. And Edmund settled on her knee and looked up at the Duke with his round face full of interest. And the Duke looked back. And for a moment she saw something crack in the careful composure, something she could not name. The trace of an older grief pressing briefly through the surface, before he looked away. She did not learn his wound that morning. She learned it 4 days later. He stayed at the convent, or rather, he stayed at the inn in the village a mile distant, and came each morning with papers and information from his man of affairs in Bath. And on the 4th day it rained, and they sat in the parlor for a long time with Edmund between them on the floor and the fire at their backs. And she asked him something routine about the filing in London. And he gave her the answer. And there was a silence afterward. And then he said, very quietly, he will not remember any of this. She knew he meant Edmund. She said, no, children do not. That is perhaps fortunate. She watched him. He was looking at the fire. Edmund was attempting to eat a wooden block Sister Agnes had provided, with intense concentration. The Duke was very still in a way that was different from his usual composure, a stillness that had something else beneath it, something pressed down. I had a son, he said. She said nothing. She kept her face quiet and her hands still in her lap. 3 years ago, a son and his mother. The birth was difficult. There were complications. He did not look at her. I was not in the house. I had been told it was proceeding well. I was not in the house. His voice did not change in pitch or register. It remained perfectly level. And that levelness, she understood, was not composure. It was the form composure had taken after something that had asked too much of it. I was named the boy's guardian. He lived 6 hours. I had not yet understood what that meant, the naming of it, before I no longer needed to understand it. She was quiet for a long moment. And so when the Earl named you Edmund's co-guardian, she said, I understood that I could not refuse. He looked at Edmund then, the round face busy with the wooden block, utterly unconcerned. Heartborn knew what he was asking. He knew I would understand it as duty. He also knew. And here the Duke paused, something working in his jaw. That I would not be able to perform it without caring, and that caring again, after 3 years of being careful not to, was what he was actually asking me to do. She did not say that she was sorry. She thought he would not want the word. She said, he trusted you to manage it. He trusted me to try. She looked at the fire. She was aware of him, of the exact distance between them, of the way the rain sounded against the parlor window, and the way Edmund had given up on the wooden block and was now attempting to crawl toward the Duke's boot with methodical determination. The Duke looked down at Edmund. Something shifted in his face. He put his hand down, flat on the floor within Edmund's reach, and Edmund grabbed his finger with the grip of a child who had never learned that some things were not available to him. "He is strong," the Duke said. "He is," she said. "He is very well." The Duke's hand remained still while Edmund held on to it, and Cecily thought that the Earl had known exactly what he was doing when he wrote that document. And she pressed the toe of her half-boot against the small round weight of the wooden horse in her pocket, and did not say anything at all. Hector came on a Wednesday. He came with his mother, and a man who introduced himself as Mr. Aldridge, a solicitor from Bath who was not Mr. Forsyth, and who had the careful confidence of a man who had been paid to have it. They arrived in a yellow carriage, and they rang the outer bell with the authority of people who did not expect to be kept waiting. And Cecily was in the parlor with Edmund and the Duke when Sister Margaret came to say that there were visitors who refused to give their names. "Vane," the Duke said. He did not say it as a question. He was already on his feet. She said, "Your Grace." "Stay here," he said. "Keep Edmund in this room." He looked at her then with the pewter eyes, and there was something in them she had not seen before, a clarity that was also a kind of urgency. He said one word, "Please." He went out. She stood at the window and watched the outer court from behind the glass. She could not hear what was said, but she saw Hector's face when the Duke walked out of the convent door, the way the careful confidence contracted and then reassembled itself. She saw Lady Dorothea's fan snap half open and then still. She saw Mr. Aldridge from Bath take a small step backward. The Duke stood in the court with his coat open and his hands at his sides, and he did not raise his voice. But something about the way he occupied the space made the Vane party look smaller than they had looked arriving. Hector said something. The Duke said something shorter. Hector's color rose. The Duke turned and went back inside. "They will return," he said, coming back into the parlor. "With a magistrate, or with something that resembles a warrant. I need to go to London." She had known it was coming. "When?" "Tomorrow. Forsyth will accompany me. We will file the instrument, and we will have an answer within the week." He looked at her steadily. "You will be safe here. The abbess will not be moved by Vane." "I know." "Vane will not be able to compel entry to church property without a magistrate's order, and a magistrate's order requires a petition to the courts, which takes time we will have used in London." He was explaining it to her as a plan, as a thing that had been worked out, and she heard in the working out of it that he had spent more than one night on it. "Your Grace," she said. He stopped. "You are going to file it," she said. "You are going to London, and you are going to file it, and you are going to come back." It was not a question. It was something that lived between a question and a statement. Something that required him to confirm a thing she could not quite say plainly. He looked at her for a moment. "Yes," he said. "I am going to come back." She had told herself she believed him. She had stood in the parlor in the gray afternoon and watched him take Edmund's hand very gently to say goodbye, and she had told herself she believed him. And she had put the wooden horse in her pocket and carried it through the rest of the day like a weight she had promised to hold. She did not entirely believe him. The world had not trained her to believe that commanding men who were under no legal obligation to return would return. He had been gone 4 days when the notice arrived. It came by magistrate's messenger on a Thursday afternoon, sealed with the county court seal, addressed to Miss Cecily Vane of no fixed abode, presently in the care of the Convent of St. Bridget of Meath. The notice required her to produce the person of Edmund Thomas Carey, infant, before the local justice at Hartbourne in 3 days' time, in consequence of a petition filed by Mr. Hector Vane, asserting the child's absence from the rightful guardianship of his nearest male relation, and questioning the legal authority of Miss Vane to detain the heir from those with a superior claim. She read it twice. She read the words she had known were coming. No established guardianship. No recognized standing. The ward of the late Lord Hartbourne and no other. A woman with no independent claim. Merely the ward. She had been at the assembly in the village 2 weeks ago with Sister Agnes, the one time she had gone outside the convent walls, and she had overheard Lady Dorothea Vane talking to a woman in grey silk near the fire. Lady Dorothea had not seen her. "The child is being kept from the family by the ward," Lady Dorothea had said, in the warm, carrying voice of a woman accustomed to defining situations. She was merely the ward, you understand. She has no claim. She simply refuses to acknowledge it. She had walked home in the dark with Sister Agnes and said nothing. She sat now in the parlor with the notice in her hands, and Edmund asleep in the room behind her, and the wooden horse on the table where she had set it when her hand would not hold it steady any longer. The Duke had been gone 4 days. If he had gone to London the morning he left, he had had time to file the instrument. He had not sent word. She thought about what it would mean to appear before a justice without him. She thought about the word merely, and the way it had followed her from the estate to the village, to the convent's outer court. She thought about the Earl pressing the wooden horse into her hand, and saying Edmund would want it when he was older. And she thought that the Earl had believed she would be there when he was older, and that the Earl had trusted her with something that was, in the end, not small. She did not send for anyone. She sat with the notice and the wooden horse and the sound of Edmund's breathing from the room behind her, and she made herself go through everything she knew, everything she could do, everything she had done already, that the world had said she was not qualified to do. She picked up the wooden horse, and she put it back in her pocket. She would go to the hearing. She would go without him if she had to. She would stand before the justice, and she would say, "I was there. I am here. I have not left." Whatever she was in the hierarchy's accounting, she had not left, and the hierarchy was going to have to reckon with that. She went in to sit with Edmund. She sat in the dark for a very long time. The hearing was in the morning room of a local gentleman who served as justice of the peace, a room with low windows and a fire that was not large enough for the cold, and when Cecily arrived it was already full. Hector stood near the fire in a blue coat. Lady Dorothea sat in a chair with her fan at half-mast. Mr. Aldridge from Bath had papers. There were 3 other gentlemen whose function she did not know, and the justice behind the desk. A heavy man with the careful face of someone who preferred not to make decisions, and 2 local women who had come for reasons she supposed had something to do with Hector's social standing in the county. Sister Margaret had come with her, and Mr. Forsyth's junior clerk, a young man named Pell, who had arrived at the convent that morning with an expression of anxious apology and a note from Mr. Forsyth explaining that Mr. Forsyth had been delayed in London and had every confidence that matters would resolve themselves satisfactorily, which was a statement she had read 3 times and found, on each reading, somewhat less reassuring than he had presumably intended. She did not have Edmund with her. She had left Edmund with Sister Agnes at the convent. She had not been legally required to produce him, only to appear. and she was not going to put the child in this room until there was a reason she was forced to. She stood where the justice indicated, and she answered his questions. Yes, she was Miss Vane. Yes, she had been the ward of the late Lord Hartbourne. Yes, Edmund Thomas Carey was in her care. She had answered questions before men with authority over her for most of her adult life, and she knew how to do it. The clear voice and the still hands and the face that did not give them any opening they had not already prepared for. Mr. Aldridge rose and read his client's petition. There was no established guardianship instrument on file. The child's nearest male relation had been unable to locate him. Miss Vane had no legal standing as guardian. She is merely the ward, Mr. Aldridge said, looking at his papers, of the deceased, with no claim established in law. She heard the words settle into the room. She heard Lady Dorothea's fan make a small, satisfied sound. She kept her hand still. The justice looked at her. He was not unkind. He was a man who enforced the procedures available to him, and the procedures available to him did not currently include a guardianship instrument and did include a petition from a man with a plausible claim and a Bath solicitor. "Miss Vane," he began. The door opened, not the front door, which was behind the Vane party. The door to the side passage, which led from the entrance hall, which connected to the street. It opened with the quiet authority of a man who had not knocked because he had decided some time ago that he would not need to. The Duke of Wexford walked in. He was not wearing his riding coat. He wore the clothes of a man who had been in London and had not stopped to change, dark and travel-creased and immaculate in the way that rank sometimes produced without effort. He had a leather case under one arm. Behind him came Mr. Forsyth, who was breathing hard, and behind Mr. Forsyth came a second man she did not know, thin and deliberate in the way of men who spent their days with documents. Hector's color shifted. Lady Dorothea's fan went completely still. The Duke crossed the room without looking at any of them until he reached the justice's desk, where he stopped and set the leather case on the desk. "Your pardon for the delay, Sir Edmund. I believe you have a question before you regarding the guardianship of the heir to the Hartbourne earldom." "I have the instrument." He opened the case. The thin man beside him produced a paper and laid it beside the Duke's document. The justice leaned forward. The Duke did not look at Cecily. She looked at him. She looked at the set of his jaw and the travel dust on his shoulders and the particular quality of his stillness, which was different from his usual stillness in a way she could not precisely name, except that it was not the stillness of a man who had been careful. It was the stillness of a man who had run and had not wanted to admit it. The justice read for a long time. Mr. Aldridge was very quiet. "This instrument," the justice said, "appears to be in order. Executed in July and witnessed. The Duke of Wexford is named co-guardian, and the co-guardian named alongside his grace is—" He paused. He looked up at Cecily, and then at the Duke. The Duke turned then. He looked at her across the low room with the inadequate fire and the two small windows, and he said in a voice that was entirely level and entirely audible, the kind of voice that did not require raising to fill a room, "Edmund's guardian is Miss Vane, and so is mine." Silence. Not the held breath kind, the kind that meant something had been said that the room was now rearranging itself around. Lady Dorothea's fan dropped to her lap. It was a small, very precise gesture. He was looking at his solicitor, and his solicitor was looking at his papers with the expression of a man who had been paid to win a case that no longer existed. Cecily stood very still. She did not trust herself to speak. She felt the wooden horse against her hip through the fabric of her gown, and she pressed her hand against her pocket without quite meaning to, and she breathed. The justice looked at both of them for a moment. "The petition," he said, with the careful tone of a man closing a door, "does not appear to have a legal foundation. Mr. Vane, I am afraid I cannot grant the relief you are seeking." He looked at Mr. Aldridge. "The guardianship is established." Mr. Aldridge collected his papers. He said nothing. He was looking at the Duke with an expression that had once been confidence and had become something diminished and rearranging, and Lady Dorothea said, in a voice that had lost some of its architecture, "This is—" She stopped. She closed her fan. "This is irregular," she said, which was not what she had planned to say, and everyone in the room knew it. The Duke did not respond to her. He looked at Cecily. She met his eyes. There was a great deal she could not say in a magistrate's hearing, with 6 people watching, and Mr. Forsyth straightening his coat, and the clerk collecting the document into his case. There was a great deal she did not yet know how to say in any room, precisely, because no one had trained her for the moment when the thing she had not let herself believe happened in front of witnesses. She said quietly, "You came back." "I said I would," he said. The hearing resolved in the time it took for the clerk to copy the document and the justice to sign the record. They walked out into the November street, she and the Duke and Mr. Forsyth, and the cold air fell across her face like the end of something. She thought she would feel triumph. She had read in enough stories that vindication felt like triumph. What it actually felt like, standing in the gray street outside a local justice's house with Edmund waiting at the convent 3 miles away, was something quieter and stranger. The sensation of having held a weight for a very long time and being permitted, at last, to put it down. The Duke stood beside her. Mr. Forsyth was talking, explaining the next procedural steps, what the filing would mean for the earldom's administration, what Vane's legal position was now, and how unlikely he was to pursue any further action. She heard him. She was also aware, with a precision she did not entirely control, of exactly where the Duke was standing relative to her in the street, the warmth of him in the cold air. "You were not going to wait for me," the Duke said, when Mr. Forsyth paused to collect a thought. She looked at him. "I was not going to let Edmund be taken because I was waiting for someone who might not come." "I understand that," he said. "I know you do." He was quiet. Then he said he would like to go back to the convent. "Yes," she said. "Edmund will be hungry." They walked. The road was cold and the air smelled of coming snow, and she put her hand in her pocket and closed it around the wooden horse, the smooth grain of it, the small carved curve of the neck that the Earl had shaped in the long idle months of his dying, and she thought about the Earl at his deathbed, pressing it into her hand, and she thought about the Duke 3 years ago, in a house that had gone wrong, and she thought about Edmund asleep in a borrowed cradle 6 weeks ago, while she sat on a stone floor and refused to put him down. She did not say any of these things. She walked, and the Duke walked beside her, and the road was quiet. And she thought that sometimes the weight of a thing was not the thing itself, but the not knowing that it surrounded it, and that the not knowing, at last, was over. 3 months later, it was spring. The convent garden in April was a different place. The stone walls had been gray and close in November, the trees bare, the paths slick with frost. In April, the stone was warm, and the herb beds had come up, and the walls were traced with ivy just leafing, and someone in the community had planted Sweet William near the gate that was just beginning to show color, and Edmund, who was 17 months old now and conducting a determined investigation of all available terrain, was working his way across the garden path with the staggering, purposeful stride of a child who had recently discovered walking and intended to deploy it comprehensively. The Duke was watching him. They sat on a stone bench near the wall, she and the Duke at a proper distance that had not been discussed and did not need to be. The sun was warm in the way that early English spring was sometimes warm, that particular quality of afternoon light that promised more than it delivered and was nonetheless something. She was holding the wooden horse. She had taken it out without thinking, the habit of 6 weeks that had not quite left her, and she turned it in her hands now. The smooth oak, the carved neck, the small, delicate legs the Earl had worried over for an afternoon because he could not get them even. "He wants it," the Duke said. She looked at Edmund, who had stopped and was looking back at them with the expression of a child who had noticed that something was happening that he was not yet involved in. "He is not old enough," she said. "The Earl said when he was old enough." "He is very much not old enough," the Duke agreed. His voice held something she had come to recognize, the trace of something almost like amusement, which in him was quiet and internal, and which she had learned in 3 months to locate by watching his jaw. "He would eat it. He would eat it," she said. She turned the horse in her hands. Edmund had resumed his investigation of the path, satisfied that whatever was happening on the bench did not require his immediate attention. She was aware of the Duke turning toward her slightly, the warmth of the sun on the stone, the sound of the bells in the church for the afternoon office, faint and familiar, the bells she had woken to for 6 weeks and had not, she found, been able to stop finding a kind of comfort in. "Miss Vane," the Duke said. She did not look up. "Your Grace, I am going to say something that I have been considering for some time," he said. "I would prefer to say it before I consider it for any longer, because I have found that considering things for longer does not generally improve my willingness to say them." She looked at him then. His face was entirely composed and entirely open in some way that it had not been in November, and she thought of the man who had said the co-guardianship as duty, as a thing that had required him to care again after 3 years of being careful not to. And she thought that the Earl had known exactly what he was asking of both of them. "I am aware," the Duke said, "that what I am about to propose is not precisely conventional, given our current situation." He was looking at her with the steady, pewter eyes. "I am also aware that you have managed the unconventional with a thoroughness that I have found, over 3 months, to be quite impossible to ignore." He paused. "I am proposing, Miss Vane, that we give Edmund 2 permanent guardians, and that we do it in a rather more definite way than the instrument provides." She was quiet. "You are proposing marriage," she said. "I am." She looked at him for a long moment. The sun was very warm on the stone. Edmund had reached the gate and was inspecting it with his hands flat against the iron bars, already testing the limits of things. She had been told what she was for most of her life. A ward. Merely the ward. A convenience, a charity, a problem to be solved or absorbed or disposed of. She had been told what she was, and she had believed most of it in the way one believes what is repeated in many voices over many years, and then she had spent 6 weeks in a convent holding a child who had no one else. And a man had arrived at her gate in the dark and told her that was not nothing. And she had felt, in the saying of it, something shift in the way a stone shifts when the river has been working at it for a long time, and at last is permitted to move it. "I will need to think," she said. She found she was almost smiling. "I am not as quick as you at deciding things." "Take as long as you require," he said. He reached over then and closed her fingers around the wooden horse. His hand was warm, and her hand was cool, and he did not pull his away. And she did not pull hers. Edmund turned from the gate and looked at them across the garden. He made a sound that was not yet a word, but that conveyed, clearly, his position on being left out of whatever was happening on the bench. She said, "Yes." The Duke did not say anything. He was looking at her, and the quiet in his face was not the quiet of composure under pressure. It was the other kind. The kind that had not been there in November. She uncurled her fingers and looked at the wooden horse in her hand, the small, carved neck, the patient legs, the piece of oak that had been shaped in the last months of a dying man's life by hands that had wanted to leave something useful. She thought that the Earl had believed she would be there when Edmund was older. She thought that the Earl had known, in the way quiet people who do the right thing without an audience sometimes know things, that she would not put it down until it was safe to. She put the wooden horse in her pocket. Edmund was already crossing the garden toward them at the determined stagger that passed for running, his face concentrated and certain, heading home.